purple today. Okay. In the first section, these are some pretty basic questions. These are the kind of things where I hope everybody gets the answer right, because they're pretty basic things. Like, which process provides the majority of Earth's oxygen? Photosynthesis does. Maybe in a unit about photosynthesis, it's a pretty obvious question. But if I were to ask this, say, on a final exam later on, after we've talked about a million other things, you might think that it's something else. But I want to assure you, photosynthesis produces oxygen, and that is where most of it is coming from. What substance is the result of anaerobic respiration? It is either lactic acid or ethanol, depending on if you're us or if you're a yeast cell. What color of light is least important to green plants? Green. So if all the light were green, there wouldn't really be much photosynthesis happening. Which step in cellular respiration produces the most ATP? The electron transport chain. It makes 34 of them. If I didn't have the electron transport chain, maximum 4 ATP. That's all I could make. Which product of the light reaction is used in the dark reaction? There's two choices, ATP or NADPH. And that's another reminder that the one with the P is in photosynthesis. NADH without a P is the one that's in cell respiration. Which is more complex, anaerobic or aerobic respiration? It's got to be aerobic. There's more steps. You need more structures. You have to have a mitochondria. Anyone have questions about any of that basic stuff? Okay, in the what category, the first two things are about carbs, lipids, and proteins. So it's important that you know that carbs and lipids have energy as their number one function. Carbs are for immediate energy, lipids are more for energy storage. And although proteins have a bazillion functions, let's really focus on the fact that they are enzymes, because that is the function that we discussed the most. Now in the what are examples of carbs, lipids, and proteins? I mean, if I showed you a question about the macromolecule tests, but instead of saying carbohydrate, I said apple juice, and you'd be like, oh, there's sugar in there, so that has to be a carbohydrate. Or if instead of lipid, I said butter, and you were like, oh, there's fat in there, so I know that's a lipid. Do you know where I might find a carb or a lipid or a protein? I would never pick something obscure that you wouldn't know about. I would only ever pick substances that either I mentioned in class, like that potatoes have starch, or substances that I think realistically you should know, like oils are fats, because that was part of our notes. What does light energy do in the chloroplast? Immediately, it excites electrons. And remember that photosystem 2 comes first. That's the first place that electrons are excited. What is the terminal acceptor in complete cellular respiration? That's oxygen. So when we talked about the electron transport chain, I said, imagine it was like a staircase and oxygen was waiting at the bottom. So it's the terminal acceptor. What process contributes more when high-intensity exercise is done? It has to be anaerobic respiration. If you said fermentation, that's a type of anaerobic respiration, so that would have been acceptable too. This, I'm just asking because I want to remind you of the word stomata, so that if you see it, you remember that's how oxygen gets out of the leaf of a plant. That's where it's going. What is the result of excited electrons in chloroplasts? Well, there's a couple of things that happen. I end up getting ATP produced, right? So the electrons move. They help chemiosmosis happen. And eventually, they help reduce NADP to NADPH. So those two substances, those energy molecules, that's the end result of all of that electron movement. Now the next part is where I ask you, do you know the products of all the reactions that we talked about? So the reactions of photosynthesis, the reactions of cell respiration. We've already mentioned the light reaction a bit. So the light reaction has these two substances. Don't forget that that's where oxygen comes from. The dark reaction, or the Calvin-Benson cycle, the main thing there is glucose, right? So if I have the two products of photosynthesis, oxygen comes from the first part, glucose comes from the second. Now the electron transport chain is where I get most of the ATP from, like we already said. It's also where I get water. Remember, because oxygen is sitting there waiting, it's grabbing hydrogen and electrons, turning back into water. Glycolysis and the Krebs cycle both have a number of products. And if you recall, it's not crucial that you know in which order the products are made, like that you know that pyruvate is the last thing in glycolysis, and the ATP and NADH come before that. You just need to know overall what is produced. So I'll just kind of go up here so I can write. The products of glycolysis are 2 ATP net, right? It's actually 4, but since we used 2 to get it started, there's only 2. 2 NADH, 2 pyruvates or pyruvic acids. So there's 2 of everything. And the products of the Krebs cycle, 2 ATP, 2 FADH2, 4 CO2, 6 NADH. There's not a lot of places where the number is really the thing that's important. Most of the time it's knowing what substances there are. And the number wouldn't be the distinguishing factor usually. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, try to focus on at least knowing which substances come from there. If you look, there's 2 of most things. So that should be your go-to number if you forget how many of something there are. For most things, I'm getting 2 of them. Anyone have questions they want to ask so far? I'll make my pen a little bit skinnier, it's too thick. So, if I get to the next point, what kind of energy is light energy transformed into during photosynthesis? It's definitely chemical because I'm making chemical substances. So the energy was the sunlight. That got absorbed into chemical bonds. That's where my energy is now. What are the possible fates of glucose in your body? Remember, it could be stored, eliminated, or used. Stored by either fat cells or as glycogen in your muscles. Eliminated by your kidneys, which are what's filtering your blood to make urine, or actually used in the mitochondria to make ATP. What is chemiosmosis? It is when hydrogen ion movement results in the production of ATP. So there's ATP synthase, hydrogen's trying to move across the membrane, and that's the only way. Now for the Calvin-Benson cycle, and it was a question on your photosynthesis quest too, I asked you very briefly, in what order do things happen? So very briefly, CO2 enters the cycle and there's this molecule, RuBP, waiting there to accept it. Then I use ATP and NADPH. So I use ATP for that third phosphate, NADPH for its hydrogen. And I end up producing glucose after the cycle goes around twice. That's the main idea. Are there other sub-steps? Of course there are. But that is the main idea that's happening. I'm taking CO2 and then I'm reducing it. I'm reducing it because I'm oxidizing NADPH. If something gets oxidized, something else has to be reduced. In the Y section, why do plants appear green? Remember, it's the idea of reflecting. They reflect green light. They don't absorb it. Why do we say cellular respiration and photosynthesis are a cycle? It's because the products of one are the reactants of the other. Why do we become out of breath after strenuous exercise? It is because we are trying to overcome oxygen deficit, right? We were using oxygen faster than our body was bringing it to us, so we started breathing more quickly so that we could meet the oxygen requirements of our muscle cells. Now up to there, does anyone have anything that they want to ask, point that they want to go over a bit more? Okay. Next point is about the macromolecule tests. So there's Benedict, there's also Biuret, iodine, Sudan 4, and the brown paper test. Now, I said this to somebody yesterday. There's a lot of detail there. How many questions would I realistically ask about macromolecule tests? Probably one on this whole entire test that you're going to do. So try to spend your time accordingly. You know, try to study effectively. Try not to spend half of your study time trying to memorize the macromolecule tests. Try to spend an amount proportionate to the fact that it was 1 point on this humongous list, because I know lots of people get bogged down in things like this. Just like on the quest you did before, it makes a great numeric response question. It would be very similar to the way I asked it the first time when I said, here's the tests, what was in each test. The next one is about enzyme activity. Inhibitors reduce enzyme activity. Cofactors and coenzymes both increase enzyme activity. The next question is about concentration. The concentration of the substrate affects enzyme activity a lot. The concentration of enzyme only a little bit. And that's because enzymes can be reused. So generally, I don't need a ton of them because I'm going to keep using them over and over again. But the concentration of substrate makes a difference. If there's no substrate to come into contact with the enzyme, the reaction will be a lot slower. How does the energy from the sun end up in a contracting muscle in your body? So that's the idea of sun, photosynthesis, we eat that somehow, cell respiration, ATP, muscle, something like that. Obviously, since you are doing the written portion on Google Classroom, this isn't a written question, but maybe something where I ask you to put things in order or to choose from a list. How many ATP are produced in cell respiration? 36 is your magic number. In each step, well, 34 come from the electron transport chain, so that's almost all of them. That's the number that you should focus on. That's where most of them come from. Is the net number different than the actual number? And this is just a small point. You actually can make 38 ATP, but because we are multicellular, we need to use 2 of them up. So theoretically, a bacterial cell could make 38 if they don't have a multicellular organism to support. How is ATP produced from those 2 molecules? The conversion is 3 or 2. 3 ATP for every 1 NADH, 2 ATP for every 1 FADH2. It would make a good numeric response question. Okay? If I ask you, how many ATP or how many NADH come from glycolysis? 2. And how many ATP does that mean? 6, because 2 times 3 is 6. How do a number of things affect the rate of photosynthesis? Light and CO2 both look like that. They increase and then they level off. Temperature is the one that looks like that. And that's because after a certain point, enzymes become denatured and they don't function anymore. How does ATP provide energy to cells? It becomes ADP and a phosphate, and the energy from that third bond is what is giving energy to cells. How do aerobic and anaerobic respiration differ? Big thing, oxygen. One of them requires it, one of them does not. The other big thing would be ATP. Aerobic respiration makes way more ATP. Anaerobic can make 4, aerobic can make 36. So that's the end of the front side of the page. Does anyone want to ask anything about any of those points or go over any of those? So, on the other side of the page, when is ATP produced during photosynthesis? Photolysis, the first part, the light-dependent reaction, that's happening on the thylakoid membranes. When is carbon dioxide produced? 2 spots, the link reaction and the Krebs cycle. When does chemiosmosis occur? Photosynthesis and cell respiration both have it. So chemiosmosis is how we produce ATP. In photosynthesis, specifically, it's photolysis. In cell respiration, electron transport chain would be your number 1 spot. Now there are listed all of the hydrogen carriers. All 3 of these are oxidized. They don't have a hydrogen. I could reduce them. I could add a hydrogen, then they would be reduced. But just remember, if it's already missing a hydrogen, I can't oxidize it anymore. When does cell respiration occur? All cells, all the time. So remember, just because photosynthesis is plants during the day, doesn't mean cell respiration is animals at night. Cell respiration is any cell that's alive any time that it needs energy. In the where category, where does oxygen come from? It comes from that molecule of water that we split apart to replace electrons. Where does cellular respiration take place? All 3 steps. So, first step happens in the cytoplasm. Any cell can do that first step. Step 2 happens in the matrix. And step 3 happens on the cristae. So those last 2 are in the mitochondria. Where does photosynthesis take place? Both reactions. It would be thylakoid membranes for the first part, stroma for the second part. Where is the energy to produce ATP stored after glycolysis in the Krebs cycle? In NADH or FADH2, because they're going to bring the hydrogens that will do chemiosmosis. Where do the excited electrons end up in the light reaction? We've already actually answered this, but they end up with NADP, and they help reduce it to NADPH. Where does the energy for muscle contraction come from? ATP turning into ADP and phosphate, like we mentioned on the other side of the page. And then where and when is lactic acid produced? Muscles. Remember, some types of cells don't do this, like brain cells. Brain cells die without oxygen. Muscles can do anaerobic respiration if you are doing strenuous exercise, for example.